There is a sentence sitting on the National Medical Commission's own website that sounds as though it was written for a different internet. It says that soliciting patients directly or indirectly is unethical. It says a physician should not use himself or herself as the subject of advertising or publicly in a way that calls attention to professional skill, qualifications, achievements, specialities, or attainments. It says physicians should not endorse a commercial product using the doctor's name, signature, or photograph. And the same code says that a physician should not give interviews or contribute articles about disease and treatments when doing so has the effect of advertising himself or soliciting practice. That is the rule book. Now open Instagram, open YouTube, search for doctors. You will find doctors explaining thyroid disease in 30 seconds, doctors reviewing supplements, doctors discussing cosmetic procedures, doctors answering common patient questions, doctors building recognizable personal brands, doctors appealing in sponsored looking content, doctors collaborating with health companies, doctors producing reels whose entire commercial value is that the audience knows the person speaking is a doctor. And here is the interesting part. I do not think the central problem is that millions of doctors are simply breaking the rules. That is too easy an explanation. The more interesting possibility is that the rule book and the market are operating with different definitions of what an advertisement actually is. The NMC code asks a question that belongs to the old world of advertising. Did the doctor solicit a patient? Did the doctor publicize his professional position? Did the doctor endorse a product? Did the communication look like an advertisement? The NMC codes asks a question that belongs to the old world of advertising. The digital market asks a different question. Did this piece of content attract attention, build trust, create a following, influence a decision, and eventually move a consumer towards a service or a product? These are not the same measurement systems. And when two systems measure different things, you can comply with one definition while commercially achieving the outcome prohibited by the other. That is the story today. Cut. Not doctors are secretly advertising, not social media is corrupting medicine, and not even the NMC is hopelessly outdated. The more precise diagnosis is this. India has a professional conduct rule designed around the category of advertisement, while the modern healthcare market increasingly operates through categories such as education, creator content, personal branding, collaboration, recommendation, awareness, and entertainment. The commercial transaction can disappear from the visible surface of the content while the economic function remains. This is a definitional problem, and definitional problems are interesting because they are not solved by telling everyone to behave better. They are solved by redesigning the boundary. The NMC's current rule landscape makes the problem even more revealing. The Commission's website continues to publish the 2002 Codes of Medical Ethics, including its advertising restrictions. NMC also lists the Registered Medical Practitioner Professional Conduct Regulations 2023. But its own rules page record the 23 August 2023 amendment notification, keeping those 2023 regulations in abeyance. In its 2023-24 annual report, the Ethics and the Medical Registration Board said that the newer conduct regulations has been resubmitted with modifications for bringing them out of abeyance. So this is not a simple story about one document sitting untouched. The regulator itself has been trying to update the framework, and yet the market moved faster than the category definitions. The Consumer Protection Act of 2019 defines advertisement extremely broadly, including audio or visual publicity, representations, endorsements, and pro announcements made through electronic media, internet, and websites. But the Department of Consumer Affairs has separately issued health and wellness influencer guidance. The ASCI has its own influencer advertisement framework built around the concept of material connection between an advertiser and an influencer. The Consumer Protection Act of 2019 defines advertisement extremely broadly. So India does not have no rules for influencer marketing. It has several rule systems. That is precisely the problem. The doctor is simultaneously a licensed professional, a publisher, an influencer, a potential advertiser, a potential service provider, and sometimes the face of a commercial brand. Each role can trigger a different regulatory logic. The result is a market in which the sentence, "This is educational content," can be doing enormous regulatory work. Because once something is classified as education rather than solicitation, the entire compliance pathway changes. And once a doctor can build a million-person audience without technically placing an advertisement for consultation in front of those million people, we have to ask what the advertising prohibition is actually measuring. Is it measuring money changing hands? Is it measuring persuasion? Is it measuring patient acquisition? Is it measuring professional self-promotion? Or is it measuring whether the communication can be labeled as an advertisement or not? Because if it is the last one, then the system has created a very predictable arbitrage opportunity. You do not have to abolish the advertisement rule to exploit that gap. You just have to move the same economic function into a different category. And that is why this episode is not really about compliance. It is about regulatory arbitrage by definition. Segment 1, the symptom. The easiest way to understand this episode is to start with what the NMC rule is trying to prevent. The 2002 Code of Medical Ethics is not irrational. In fact, it is you stripping away the dated language and put yourself in regulator's position. The basic design problem is quite sensible. Medicine is not ordinary consumer purchase. A patient usually cannot evaluate the technical quality of a cardiologist, an oncologist, or a surgeon before buying the service. The patient may not even be capable of evaluating it afterwards. The professional, therefore, has an information advantage, and that information asymmetry changes what advertisement can do. If a restaurant says it has the best dosa in the town, consumers can try it, compare it, and leave a review. If a surgeon says he is the best surgeon in the town, the consumer cannot run a controlled experiment. That asymmetry is one of the reasons professional regulation exists. The old advertising rule, therefore, tries to suppress a particular class of behavior, direct or indirect solicitation, self-aggrandizement, endorsements, claim of skill, publicity around achievements, and communications that effectively turn professional authority into a marketing instrument. Again, that logic is defensible. The problem begins when market changes the delivery mechanism. In 2002, if a doctor wanted to attract patients, the obvious commercial object were advertisements, newspaper articles, signboards, clinic publicity, hospital brochures, and perhaps television appearances. The boundary between the information and promotion was comparatively visible. A modern creator does something different. The doctor does not need to say, "Book an appointment with me." The doctor can spend 6 months answering questions about acne, menopause, infertility, hair loss, or diabetes. The audience learns the doctor's specialty. The audience learns where the doctor works. The audience learns what the doctor believes. The doctors become familiar. Then when the person actually needs care, the doctor is no longer an unknown professional in a search result. The doctor is a known person. This is extraordinarily valuable. And it is exactly why attention itself has become an economic asset. The modern healthcare creator is therefore not necessarily selling a consultation in the video. The creator may be accumulating something more upstream: preference. That distinction is the first crack in the old rule. The direct advertisement asks for an immediate transaction. Content marketing can ask for nothing today and still alter the probability of a transaction 6 months from now. A doctor can educate a viewer about the symptoms of endometriosis without saying, "Come to my clinic." The content may be completely useful. It may be evidence-based. It may improve health literacy, and it may simultaneously increase the doctor's future patient acquisition probability. Those statements are not mutually exclusive. That is the uncomfortable point. A piece of communication can have a public health value and commercial value at the same time. The regulatory systems wants a binary category. The market produces a hybrid. That is what makes this a mechanism design problem. Consider a simple patient journey. A patient experiences a symptom. The patient searches online. The patient encounters 10 doctors. Doctor A has no content. Doctor B has a hospital profile. Doctor C has 20 educational videos. And Doctor D has 200 short form videos, a recognizable face, thousands of comments, and a large audience. None of these needs to say, "I am advertising myself." But the information environment has changed dramatically. The patient has now a familiarity signal. That signal may be useful. It may be commercially valuable. This is where the distinction between advertisement and influence becomes crucial. Advertisement is a communication category. Influence is an economic function. The same communication can be classified as educational while functioning as an influence. And once influence becomes the economic function, the old compliance tests become too less informative. The regulator can ask, "Did you advertise?" The market can answer, "No." The patients can still walk into doctor's clinic because of what she saw online. This is not necessarily misconduct, but it is a measurement failure if the regulation was intended to prevent patient solicitation and the system measures only explicit advertisement. This is the same problem we have discussed elsewhere in this series with accreditation. Cut. When an institution optimizes for the measurable object can improve while the underlying object remains unchanged. That is the version of Goodhart's law. When a measure becomes the target, it ceases to become a good measure. Here, the target is absence of something labeled as an advertisement. So the market learns to remove the label. The commercial function does not necessarily disappear. It migrates. That is the symptom. And now we can frame the episode properly. The question is not why doctors follow the advertisement rule. The more useful question is, why does the regulatory system classify communications by their visible form when the digital market is increasingly competes on their economic function? That is the frame for the rest of this episode. We are going to look at 4 mechanisms. First, category arbitrage. Education and advertisement can be separated legally or rhetorically while remaining connected economically. But second, market attention substitution. The platform does the patient acquisition work that an advertisement used to do without the doctor buying a conventional advertisement. Third, regulatory fragmentation and principal agent problems. NMC, consumer regulators, advertising self-regulating platforms, hospitals and brands see each other piece of transaction. And fourth, the disclosure paradox. The system is getting better at identifying paid influencer relationships, but professional ethics is still built around a different question: whether the doctor's public communication itself constitutes solicitation or self-promotion. One of those 4 mechanisms are visible. The loophole stops looking mysterious, it becomes predictable. Segment 2, failure mode 1, category arbitrage. The first mechanism is regulatory arbitrage through categorization. Regulatory arbitrage sounds complicated, but the basic idea is simple. If two activities produce similar outcomes but fall into different legal or regulatory categories, the actor has an incentive to structure the activity so that it enters the category with the lower compliance burden. The important word is structure. You do not necessarily violate the rule. You change the shape of the activity until the rule no longer clearly applies. That is exactly what becomes possible when a professional advertising rule meets the creator culture. The NMC's 2002 Creator Code says solicitation is unethical and restricts self-proportional publicity. The draft 2003 Conduct Framework went even further in the technology context. It said advertisement of registered medical practice was not allowed on telemedicine platform under any pretext, and it addressed ratings, reviews, promotions, and algorithmic manipulation. But notice the structure of the problem. The regulation is trying to identify a prohibited communication. The creator economy is trying to produce an audience. An audience is itself not an advertisement. A follower is not a patient. A video is not necessarily a solicitation. A podcast is not necessarily a promotion. A doctor answering questions is not necessarily an endorsement. Every individual statement can therefore be defensible. The aggregate system can still be commercially powerful. This is where definitions matter more than intentions. Imagine a doctor publishes a series of videos called 5 Things Women Should Know About PCOS. This is an educational content. The doctor never says, book now. The doctor never says, I am the best. The doctor never gives a discount. The doctor never claims a guaranteed cure. At the level of a single post, there may be nothing objectionable. Now imagine that every video contains the doctor's name, specialty, clinic identity, location, visual branding, and the links to the doctor's professional profile. Again, that may be entirely reasonable. Patient should know who is speaking. Now imagine the doctor becomes a trusted voice with hundreds and thousands of followers. Still, the individual video can remain educational. But the aggregate effect is no longer simply information dissemination. It is a reputation formation. Reputation formation is economically valuable. And in severe information asymmetry, reputation is one of the most important inputs into the patient choices. So what's the regulator actually supposed to regulate? If it regulates the topic, it risks suppressing useful public education. If it regulates the presence of a doctor's name, it makes useful attribution impossible. If it regulates links to the clinic, it may prevent patients from finding a legitimate care. If it regulates audience size, it creates an arbitrary threshold. If it regulates intent, intent is difficult to prove. If it regulates commercial outcome, then almost any successful educational account could be accused of influencing patient choice. This is not a simple compliance problem. It is a classification problem with no obvious clean boundaries. And the system's difficulty is increased by the fact that the government itself recognizes educational communication as valuable. The old NMC code permit doctors to communicate with the public on matters of public health, allows public health lectures, radio, television, and internet chat for that purpose. The problem is that the same code warns against communication that have an effect of advertisement and soliciting practice. That is a sensible distinction in principle. But on the internet, public education and professional visibility are structurally intertwined. A doctor cannot make a video without becoming visible. A doctor cannot build public trust without creating a reputation. A doctor cannot answer questions without demonstrating expertise, and expertise is precisely one of those things the old advertisement code treats as sensitive when used for self-promotion. The rule is therefore caught between two legitimate goals. Goal 1, do not let professional authority become a marketing weapon that exploits patient information asymmetry. Goal 2, let qualified professional communicate useful medical information to the public. The loophole appears in the overlap. The same expertise that makes the information valuable also makes the communicator commercially valuable. That is why educational content is not simply a complete regulatory category. It describes the content's apparent purpose. It does not describe the content's economic function. And the digital economy is very good at turning apparent purpose into economic function. Consider influence marketing. ASCI's influence guidelines do not define an influencer merely as someone who has a large following. The definition focuses on access to an audience and the power to affect purchasing decisions or opinions because of authority, knowledge, position, or relationship with that audience. It also defines a material connection as a connection between advertiser and influencer that may affect the weight or credibility of the representation, including compensation and other incentives. This is a very different conceptual model from the NMC's traditional advertisement role. ASCI starts with influence. Professional ethics starts with solicitation and publicity. Consumer law starts with advertisement and whether it is misleading. The creator economy starts with attention. 4 systems, 4 measurement languages, 1 person, the doctor, that is the structural gap. And once you see it, you can predict the behavior. A doctor who wants to grow an audience has an incentive to remain inside the educational category because education is socially legitimate, algorithmically rewarded, and easier to defend than advertisement. A brand that wants access to doctors' credibility has an incentive to frame the relationship as content, collaboration, or education rather than conventional advertisement. A platform that has an incentive to maximize engagement because engagement in its revenue engine. The patient has an incentive to consume concise, understandable information from a person who appears credible. And the regulator has an incentive to preserve a bright line rule because bright lines are easier to reinforce rather than questions about cumulative influence. Every actor is behaving rationally. The system still produces a gap. This is the same logic as our previous discussions of incentive design. You do not need a bad actor to create a bad equilibrium. You only need individually rational decisions that interact badly. The first failure mode, then, is not that doctors have discovered a secret loophole. It is that regulatory category advertisement has become too narrow to capture the full economic pathway through which a modern healthcare influence is generated. And that leads us to the second mechanism. The second failure mode is what I would call attention market substitution. The old system assumed that if a doctor wanted to acquire patients, the doctor would advertise. The new system offers another route. Build an audience first. Patient acquisition becomes a downstream effect. This distinction matters because it changes the observable transaction. Suppose a doctor spends rupee 1 lakh on advertisement. That is easy to identify. There is a pair, there is an ad placement, there is a campaign, there is a creative asset, there may be a media invoice. The communication is explicitly promotional. Now suppose the same doctor spends 6 months producing educational videos. There may be no advertisement spending at all. The doctor pays with time. The platform pays with distribution. The audience pays with attention. And the doctor accumulates an asset, a trusted audience. That audience can later generate economic value through consultations, hospital referrals, courses, speaking, books, product collaborations, sponsorships, and brand partnerships. The commercial pathway exists, but it is distributed across time. This is important because traditional compliance systems are often designed around transactions. Digital influence is designed around accumulation. You do not necessarily sell at the moment you communicate. You accumulate trust at the one moment and monetize it later. That makes the conventional definition of advertising increasingly brittle. A television commercial is an event. A creator account is an asset. An asset can influence transactions without every individual communicating being transactional. This is why the word influencer matters. Influence is not same as advertisement. A person can influence behavior without being paid by the brand for every recommendation. A doctor can influence patient choice simply by becoming the most familiar specialist in a particular topic. And that influence can be economically valuable even if no money changes hands between the doctor and the platform. The market has therefore substituted attention accumulation for advertising expenditure. This is a major shift in the mechanism. It also explains why branding advertising alone is unlikely to eliminate professional self-promotion. If the economic objective is the patient acquisition and advertising is blocked, the actor searches for another acquisition channel. That is called search engine optimization. Educational content, podcasts, short form videos, patient testimonials, collaborations, media interviews, hospital content, brand partnership, professional communities. None of these is inherently unethical. That is the point. A good regulatory design cannot simply list every possible communication channel and prohibit them. It has to distinguish between beneficial public communication and exploitative commercial influence. Otherwise, the rule becomes either too broad or too irrelevant. And there is another mechanism at work here, algorithmic selection. The platform decides what users see. The doctors does not need to buy the patient attention directly. The platform's recommendation engine distributes content according to the engagement signals. This means the platform becomes an intermediary in patient acquisition. But the NMC rule was not designed around algorithmic intermediaries. The old model is approximately doctor, advertisement, and patients. The modern model is closer to doctor, content, algorithm, audience, trust, future search, and patient choice. This is a completely different causal chain. The advertisement has disappeared from the middle. Its economic function has not necessarily disappeared. It has been decomposed into multiple steps. This is why I would resist the phrase, doctors are bypassing the NMC. Some may be, but the more interesting story is that the market itself has changed. The path between professional identity and consumer choice. Regulation has to follow the path, not merely the label. Now there is an important counterpoint here. We should not turn every educational video into an implied advertisement. That would be absurd. If a cardiologist explains the warning signs of a heart attack, that is public health communication. If a dermatologist explains why sunscreen matters, this is useful information. If an endocrinologist explains how HbA1c works, that is education. If the regulatory system treats all of these activities as commercial solicitation simply because they increase professional visibility, the result will be worse public health communication. And that is precisely why the loophole persists. The regulator cannot easily say, if your content makes you more famous, it's advertisement. That would make the regulator responsible for suppressing one of the most useful forms of modern health communication. The problem therefore becomes one of threshold design. At what point the public education becomes professional promotion? At what point does a doctor's personal brand becomes a commercial asset? At what point does the brand collaboration becomes a medical endorsement? At what point does a patient testimonial becomes a solicitation? At what point does a clinic link transform information into acquisition? Those are the questions the modern rule book needs to answer. And this is where another law becomes relevant. The Consumer Protection Act defines advertisement broadly into audio or visual publicity, representations, endorsements, or pronouncements made through electronic media, the internet, or the websites. It also defines misleading advertisement and gives the Central Consumer Protection Authority powers relating to false or misleading advertisements. So the broader consumer protection system has already moved towards a functional view of advertisement. It does not care whether something looks like a newspaper ad. It cares whether the communication is an advertisement and whether it is misleading consumers. Then in 2023, the Department of Consumer Affairs issued additional influencer guidance for health and wellness celebrity influencers and virtual influencers. Those guidelines recognize that health influencers can share information, promote products or services, or make health-related claims, and they require disclosure in relevant circumstances. This is a sign of system adapting. But the adaptation is happening in a different regulatory cycle. And that brings us to failure mode 3. Regulatory fragment and the principal agent problem. The third failure mode is fragmentation. And this is one of the most subtle because it involves institutions that each doing something reasonable. The NMC regulates the professional conduct of registered medical practitioners. The consumer protection system regulates misleading advertisements and unfair trade practices. The ASCI operates a self-regulatory advertisement code and influencer guidelines. Platforms have their own advertising and content policies. Hospitals have corporate communication teams. Brands have marketing agencies. Influencers have managers. Doctors may have personal social media teams. And the patient sees one piece of content. The patient does not see the regulatory architecture behind this. Cut. This is a classic coordination problem. Each institution owns a piece of that mechanism, but no one institution necessarily sees the entire causal chain. The NMC can ask the doctor whether engaged in an unethical professional conduct. The ASCI can ask whether an advertisement has the necessary disclosure or violates its code. A consumer regulator can ask whether the health claim is misleading. Who asks the system level question? Who asks what is the commercial relationship between this doctor's professional authority, this audience, this brand, this hospital, this clinic, and this piece of content? That layer is missing. And that is a classic principal agent problem. The public wants medical communication that is accurate, independent, and patient-centered. The doctor wants professional autonomy and perhaps practice growth. The hospital wants patient volume and brand visibility. The platform wants engagement. The brand wants credibility and sales. The influencer wants audience growth and monetization. The regulator wants safe communication and enforceable rules. Those objectives overlap, but they are not identical. The principle, the public interest, cannot perfectly observe the agent's incentive. This creates room for misalignment. Now add a medical credential. A doctor is not simply another creator. The title doctor changes the credibility of the communication. The viewer may interpret as doctor's statement as expert judgment rather than ordinary opinion. This is why healthcare influences regulation has special disclosure requirements. The Department of Consumer Affairs explicitly said certified medical practitioners and health and fitness experts should disclose their professional status when sharing information, promoting products or services, or making health-related claims in the covered context. It also says influencers present themselves as health tech or medical practitioners should provide clear disclaimers in the relevant situations. This is a recognition of information asymmetry. The problem is that disclosure solves only a part of it. Disclosure tells the audience that there is a relationship. It does not automatically tell the audience whether the recommendation itself is appropriate. Imagine a doctor says, this supplement is sponsored content. The viewer knows it is sponsored, but the viewer still may not know whether the evidence supports the medical claim. The disclosure fixes transparency. It does not necessarily fix persuasion. That distinction matters. The NMC framework is much more restrictive because professional ethics is concerned not only with misleading claims, but with the use of professional authority for solicitation and commercial endorsement. So we end up with two different policy philosophies. Consumer regulation says, in effect, if you are advertising, disclose the commercial relationship and do not mislead the consumer. Professional ethics says even truthful commercial promotion by a doctor may be inappropriate because it changes the professional relationship. Neither principle is irrational, but they answer different questions. And that means the doctor can potentially satisfy the consumer law disclosure requirement while still sitting in an ambiguous space under professional ethics. That ambiguity is not a trivial legal technicality. It changes behavior. If the doctor knows that disclosure is enough for one regulator, but the professional rule book remains unclear, the rational response is not necessarily to stop creating content. The rational response is to create content that stays just inside the least costly interpretation. This is regulatory arbitrage again. But now it's the institution rather than purely definitional. There is another fragmentation problem. The regulated entity. The NMC can regulate doctors. But the commercial campaign may be controlled by a hospital, agency, brand, or platform. Suppose a hospital publishes a video featuring a doctor. Who is advertising? The doctor, the hospital, the production company, the platform, the brand supplying the product. Suppose the doctor is paid to appear in a health product campaign. The doctor may say the content was produced by the brand. The brand may say that the doctor is an independent expert. The agency may say it merely facilitated the collaboration. The platform may say it merely distributed the content. Every actor has a partial defense. The consumer has one experience. That is why the NMC's own annual report is revealing. During 2023-24, its ethics section said, guidelines to regulate unethical advertisement by private hospital has been prepared and submitted for approval, alongside guidelines concerning live surgeries and quackery. It also said 2023 professional conduct regulations, which had been kept in abeyance, were resubmitted with modifications. In other words, the institution itself appears to recognize that the existing regulatory architecture does not neatly map onto the modern market. That is important because it means the correct diagnosis is not regulators who do not understand social media. The regulator does understand there is a problem. The harder question is how to design the rule without destroying the legitimate benefits of public education. That is a much more interesting policy problem. And it brings us to the fourth failure. The fourth failure mode is a disclosure paradox. India has been moving towards a more disclosure in influence marketing. That's good. But disclosure can become a compliance target that creates appearance of transparency while leaving the deeper incentive structure untouched. This is where Goodhart's law returns. Suppose the policy goal is independent, trustworthy health communication. The regulator introduces a measurable requirement. Disclose material connections. The industry learns the requirement. The post gets a label. The campaign can now say the relationship was disclosed. The metric improves. But the underlying problem disappeared. Not necessarily. A disclosure can technically be visible and psychologically ineffective. The average viewer does not necessarily evaluate the meaning of paid partnership with the same sophistication as a regulator. And the more important problem is that doctor can produce thousands of pieces of non-sponsored content that build the audience later used for sponsored or commercial activity. The commercial relationship can therefore be separated from the trust-building relationship. That is the core paradox. The content that earns trust does not have to be sponsored. The sponsored content can arrive later. So if the regulator looks only for the material connection on the individual post, it may miss the broader economic architecture. Now, I want you to be careful here. That does not mean that every doctor audience is a disguised advertisement. It does not mean doctors should stop educating public. It does not mean a doctor who accepts a sponsorship is automatically unethical. And it certainly does not mean that every influencer relationship is deceptive. The point is narrower. A disclosure rule is the strongest when primary problem is hidden sponsorship. It is weaker when the primary problem is the conversation of the professional authority into commercial preference. Those are different mechanisms. Imagine two posts. Post A. I am a dermatologist. Here are 3 evidence-based ways to reduce sun damage. No sponsor. Post B. I am a dermatologist. Here is a sunscreen I recommend, sponsored by brand X. The disclosure solves an important problem in post B. The audience knows there is a commercial relationship. But suppose the doctor's entire channel has spent 2 years establishing the doctor as a trusted authority on skin health. The commercial value of that relationship existed before the post B. The sponsorship is only the monetization event. This is why the policy questions has to move from was this post sponsored to what is the nature of the professional commercial relationship represented by this communication. This is harder. But harder questions are sometimes the ones that actually correspond to the objective. There is another Goodhart problem. If regulators prohibit explicit promotional language, creators can shift towards softer signals. Many of my patients ask about people come to my clinic with, In my practice, I have seen my patients love. These are products I personally use. I often recommend. Again, any one of these statements can be perfectly legitimate. The issue is the cumulative effect. The audience is being trained to associate a person with a service, a product, a specialty, or an outcome. The system has removed the hard sell. It has not removed persuasion. And that distinction is central to influencer economics. Influencers rarely behave like traditional advertisers. The commercial power comes from seeing less like advertiser. That is the business model. A conventional advertisement says, this is an advertisement. Influencer market says, this is the person you trust telling you something. The regulatory challenge is therefore not simply to identify false statements. It is to manage the credibility transfer. The doctor transfers professional credibility to the content. The platform transfers distribution. The audience transfers attention. The brand, the hospital, the clinic can potentially transfer money. The patient transfers of purchasing decisions. That chain is the modern transaction. The old advertisement rule focuses heavily on one link. The market operates across all of them. That is why definitional loopholes matters. And there is a final issue. The word direct to consumer. Traditional direct-to-consumer advertisement implies a seller communicating directly to the potential buyer. But a doctor creator can communicate to consumers without presenting the communication as a sale. The audience may not even be thinking about buying healthcare. The patient may simply be watching a video about migraines at 11:30 in the night. The commercial effect can happen later. So the old category, direct-to-consumer advertisement, is not necessarily wrong. It is incomplete. It describes the communication channel, but not the time horizon of influence. And once influence becomes longitudinal, the compliance tests become harder. The system must distinguish between public education, public reputation, patient acquisition, commercial endorsement, and paid influence. Those are not the same thing, but they can occupy the same piece of content. This is where a good regulatory system should stop asking for a perfect binary distinction and start building graduated obligations, which is where the counter argument begins. There is a useful way to test whether a definition is still fit for purpose. Imagine the same economic function, the same economic outcome being produced through different 5 routes. The rule is not necessarily controlling the outcome, it is controlling the route. Route 1 is a conventional advertisement. A doctor pays publication, a platform to put an ad message in front of potential patients. Route 2 is owned by media. The doctor builds a website and publishes search-friendly articles. Route 3 is creator media. The doctor makes the reels, short podcast. Route 4 is earned media. A journalist interviews the doctor because the doctor has become a recognizable expert. Route 5 is institutional media. The hospital produces content featuring its doctors. The patient can arrive at the same decisions through 5 routes. The regulatory burden, however, can be dramatically different. That creates a substitution effect. If one route is expensive or prohibited, the activity migrates to others. This is not evidence of bad faith. It is what rational actors do when facing constraints. We have seen versions of this in other healthcare markets. When a price is capped, the firm changes the product mix. When a procurement category is rigid, hospitals move expenditure into another budget category. When an accreditation metric is narrow, organizations optimize around the metric. The mechanism is always the same. Behavior follows the payoff structure. You have seen different versions in this other healthcare market. The doctor influencer market simply applies that logic to attention. And there is a second order effect. Once a doctor becomes successful through educational content, other doctors observe the result. The behavior diffuses. Medical students see it. Young specialists see it. Hospitals see it. Brands see it. Agencies emerge to serve it. A new commercial industry forms around a previously prohibited commercial function. That matters because a regulator is no longer dealing with isolated individual, it is dealing with an ecosystem. An ecosystem that has suppliers, intermediaries, distribution channels, and feedback loops. The doctor supplies the expertise, the platform supplies the distribution, the audience supplies the attention, the agency supplies production and commercial matchmaking, the brand supplies money or products, and the hospital supplies institutional credibility. and the patient supplies the ultimate economic signal: choice. If NMC focuses only on doctor's speech, it sees one component of a much larger system. That is why the definition of advertisement matters so much. The word determines where the regulator looks. If the regulator defines the problem as paid promotional speech, it will look for payment. If it defines the problem as solicitation, it will look for calls to action. If it defines the problem as misleading health claim, it will look for evidence and accuracy. If it defines the problem as personal influence, it has to look at the relationship between authority, audience, and commercial interest. A doctor does not need to lie to influence a patient. A doctor does not need to exaggerate credentials. A doctor does not need to promise a cure. Authority itself can be persuasive. That is why professional regulation exists in the first place. The challenge is to preserve the value of the authority without pretending that the authority can be separated from the communication. And this is where the education versus advertisement distinction can become unstable. Suppose a doctor has a channel entirely devoted to explaining a particular disease. Over time, the channel becomes the most visible source of information about that disease in a particular language. The doctor has not purchased advertising. The doctor has not explicitly solicited patients. Yet the doctor has acquired something that conventional advertisement could happily pay for: attention from a highly relevant audience. The audience is segmented by medical interest. That is commercially valuable targeting. That difference is that targeting was created through content rather than brought through media placement. Again, this is not automatically unethical. In fact, it may be socially beneficial. But if the regulator's objective is to prevent commercial exploitation or professional authority, then the economic functions deserve attention even when the content itself is useful. This is the policy dilemma at the center of this episode. A rule that is too weak to allow commercial arbitrage. A rule that too strong to suppress public education. The correct answer is therefore not a stronger version of the old binary. It is a better taxonomy. The other reason the old rule struggles is that the professional identity itself has become a media product. In the 20th century model, a doctor had a professional identity and a practice. The identity supported the practice. In a creator model, the professional identity can become the content. The doctor's explanations are consumed independently whether the viewer becomes a patient or not. That changes the economic asset. A doctor is no longer merely selling clinic time. A doctor may be accumulating an audience. An audience can monetize in several ways. That creates a new principal agent problem inside the doctor's own professional role. When doctor does the primary act as a clinician, when doctor does the act as a publisher, doctor acting as influencer, doctor as acting as a commercial endorser. The same person can occupy 4 roles in a single week, sometimes in a single video. A regulation written for one role will predictably underperform when the role merges. This is why professional titles matters. A doctor who discloses a mattress is not equivalent from a viewer's perspective to a lifestyle influencer discussing a mattress. A doctor brings a professional credibility signal into communication. The product may be unrelated to medicine. The audience may still infer medical authority. The same issue becomes more serious with supplements, diagnostics, cosmetic procedures, fertility products, weight management products, and devices because the commercial object sits closer to the clinical decision. This is where risk-based regulation becomes more sensible than channel-based regulation. 30-second explanation of how vaccine work should face a very different compliance burden from a sponsored claim that particular product prevents a disease. The channel is the same, the risk is not. This is one of the strongest arguments for moving beyond a generic social media rule. The regulator should care less about whether the communication happened on Instagram and more about the communication, what the communication is doing. There is another subtle problem: patient testimonials. The NMC's social media guidance in 2022 said RMP should not request or share patient testimonials, recommendations, endorsement, or reviews on social media, and should refrain from sharing images of healed and cured patients or impressive procedure results. That is a particularly important design choice because testimonials are one of the most powerful forms of modern marketing. Why? Because they transfer the claim from a professional to another person. The doctor no longer says I'm excellent. The patient says it. The doctor no longer says my results are impressive. The before and after image appears to say it. This is exactly why the restriction making economic sense. But it also demonstrates how quickly the market can move around formal categories. If the testimonials are restricted, the creator can produce educational stories. If before and after images are restricted, the creator can produce general procedure explanations. If explicit claims are restricted, the creator can build familiarity through repeated educational content. This is why a rule based on isolated content types will always be one step behind the creator economy. The regulator needs to govern the underlying incentives. There is a related issue with the algorithm popularity. The platform does not distinguish between a scientifically excellent explanation and a scientifically mediocre explanation simply because the former is a better medicine. The algorithm optimizes observable engagement. Engagement can correlate with usefulness. It can also correlate with novelty, controversy, fear, uncertainty, emotional intensity, and oversimplification. This creates a selection problem. The doctor who says the evidence is mixed and depends upon patient characteristics may produce less engaging content than the doctor who says this one mistake is destroying your hormones. The latter may attract more views without providing better medical information. This is not specifically an NMC problem, but it is an information market problem. The professional regulation has to interact with it because the platform rewards the very communication styles that can create risk in medicine. A doctor who remains accurate but boring may lose attention. The regulator, therefore, cannot solve the problem by merely saying, be truthful. Truthfulness is necessary, but the incentive to simplify remains. There is another reason why the old advertisement boundary is insufficient. Advertisement law traditionally looks at the message. Creator economies also require us to look at the distribution mechanisms. The fragmentation problem becomes even more clearer when we consider enforcement. Suppose a doctor receives a complaint because a video promoted a supplement. The first question is, who is the advertiser? If the brand paid the doctor, consumer and advertisement rules may apply. If the hospital produced the content, institutional advertisement rules may become relevant. If the doctor independently purchased the supplement and recommended it, the commercial relationship may be absent, but professional ethics question can remain. If a doctor receives affiliate income only when viewers purchase, the economic connection exists even though there is no conventional sponsorship fee. If the doctor receives free products rather than cash, the relationship may still be material. ASCI's concept of material connection is useful precisely because it moves beyond cash-only advertisement. But a professional regulator needs to go one step further. The doctor's professional status itself is a material source of credibility. That credibility is not a payment problem. It is a credential. And it is precisely the credential that makes the endorsement powerful. This is the deeper reason why doctor influence regulation cannot simply copy general influencer regulation. The doctor is both a messenger and a regulated professional. Now consider the hospital. Hospital have a strong incentive to build physician brands because physician reputation can drive patient choices, referrals, and service line growth. A hospital can therefore create a sophisticated content operation around its doctors while maintaining a formal distinction on how hospital advertisement and doctors advertising. The content may be branded as health education. The doctor appears in. The hospital logo appears. The viewers learn the doctor's specialty. The viewers learns there is a doctor who practices. The viewers associate the doctors with the institution. That is not necessarily prohibited under any rule, but that is plainly a patient acquisition mechanism in economic terms. This is why NMC's annual report reference to work on guidelines for unethical advertising by private hospitals is significant. The regulator appears to recognize that the professional conduct cannot be separated cleanly from the institutional marketing. The institutional boundary is therefore another place where the old model breaks. The disclosure paradox has a similar institutional dimension. A viewer may see an ad and correctly understand that the content is sponsored, but the viewer may not know whether the doctor owns the clinic being promoted. The viewer may not know whether the doctor receives formal referral payments. The viewer may not know whether the hospital employs the doctor. The viewer may not know whether the product is being recommended because of evidence or because of a commercial relationship. A single disclosure label cannot communicate all of that. So the future framework should distinguish commercial disclosure from conflict of interest disclosure. They may overlap, but they are not identical. A paid advertisement is a commercial relationship. A doctor's ownership stake in a clinic is a financial interest. A product advisory role is a professional commercial relationship. An affiliate link is a performance-based incentive. An unpaid recommendation can still be influenced by a broader relationship. These are different incentive structures. A mature system should make them legible. Finally, there is an enforcement asymmetry. A conventional advertisement leaves evidence, contracts, invoices, media buys, and creative approvals. An organic creator account may not. A doctor can say, I made this because patient asked me the question. That may be true. The same content can increase bookings. A regulator has to distinguish ordinary professional communication from strategic solicitation without access to the doctor's internal intention. That is why intent is a weak enforcement criteria. Better regulation should rely more heavily on observable features, commercial relationships, call to action, booking pathways, claims, testimonials, financial interest, repeated promotions of a service, and the presence of material incentives. That makes the rule more objective. And once that rule is objective, doctors can comply without guessing what the regulator might think. That is the real goal of a good regulation. Not maximum prohibition, but predictable boundaries. The counter argument. Let me now steelman the other side properly, because this episode would be intellectually weak if the conclusion simply was the NMC should modernize and allow doctors' influence to advertise. This is not the argument. There are at least 3 serious reasons why the current restriction exists, and some of them still remains powerful in 2026. First, medical advertisement is not ordinary advertisement because the information asymmetry is usually severe. A patient choosing a surgeon may not be able to evaluate the surgeon's technical quality. The patient choosing a fertility specialist may be vulnerable to promises about outcomes. A cancer patient may be desperate for certainty. A person considering cosmetic surgery may be influenced by a before and after image that does not represent the median outcome. A patient choosing a surgeon may not be able to evaluate the surgeon's technical quality. The patient choosing a fertility specialist may be vulnerable to promises about outcomes. The regulator therefore has a legitimate reason to be more cautious about professional self-promotion than about restaurant marketing. The fact that social media has changed does not eliminate that reason. Second, there is a genuine public health benefit in keeping professional communication separated from aggressive commercial incentives. If every doctor is encouraged to market constantly, the information environment can become too noisy. The loudest doctor may not be the best doctor. The doctor with the best video editor may not be the best clinician. The doctor who understands algorithm may outperform the doctor who understands evidence. This is not necessarily a desirable allocation of attention. But medicine is one of the sectors where popularity and competence can diverge dramatically. Third, the existing code is not simply anti-communication. The 2002 code explicitly permits doctors to communicate on public health matters and to deliver public lectures, radio, television talks, and internet chats for public health purposes. The draft 2023 social media guidance similarly recognizes that RMPs should provide factual, verifiable information and educative material to the general public, while setting restrictions around patient treatment on public platforms, testimonials, paid followers, and promotional content. So the system is not saying doctors must be silent online. It is trying to draw a line between education and solicitation. That is legitimate. The difficulty is that internet has made that line porous. Fourth, disclosure regimes are not meaningless. The Department of Consumer Affairs Health and Wellness Influencer Guidelines is a real step towards transparency. The ASCI's influencer guidelines recognize material connections. The Consumer Protection Act gives the consumer protection the authority powers against misleading advertisements. These mechanisms can catch genuinely deceptive content, and the market has already started building norms around disclosure. So it would be unfair to describe the system as doing nothing. It is self-correcting. The NMC itself has been reviewing professional conduct rules, including social media, advertisement by private professionals, and live surgeries. Its annual report records that 2023 conduct regulations were kept in abeyance and later resubmitted with modifications. That is the evidence of institutional adaptation, not institutional paralysis. The harder counter argument is about enforcement capacity. Even if we agree the definition should change, how you enforce it. Imagine a regulator receiving a complaint against a doctor with 800 videos. Which videos are educational? Which videos are promotional? Which are sponsored? Which were produced by the hospital? Which were produced independently? Which generated appointments? Which increased the doctor's visibility but did not generate immediate business? How do you prove intent? How do you distinguish between a doctor answering a patient question from a doctor who is strategically harvesting a patient niche? If the regulator requires pre-approvals of social media content, it will become impossible to operate at that scale. If it regulates only explicit advertisement, the loophole remains. If it regulates influence, it risks becoming a speech regulator. If it regulates money, it misses unpaid self-promotion. If it regulates patient acquisition, it creates enormous evidentiary burdens. If it regulates patient acquisition, it creates enormous evidentiary burdens. That is why the current system has survived. The problem is not merely that nobody has thought of the loophole. The problem is that every alternative creates a new cost. And there is another reason to be cautious. Doctors are increasingly competing for attention with non-doctors who make health claims with much less professional accountability. If qualified doctors are pushed off social media while wellness creators remain highly visible, the public health information environment may actually deteriorate. A regulator that is too restrictive towards licensed professionals can unintentionally subsidize unlicensed influence. This is a serious unintended consequence. So the honest position is not that NMC should abolish advertising prohibition. The honest position is that the prohibition still protects something valuable: independence and protection from exploitation. But its categories no longer map cleanly onto how professional influence is produced online. And that means the system needs a better boundary. Not no boundary, a better one. The question is how to design it. There is also a legitimate argument that the word advertisement should remain narrow because law depends on administrability. Regulators cannot enforce an abstract theory of influence against millions of pieces of content. They need rules that a doctor can understand and disciplinary body can consistently apply. That is why bright line prohibitions have survived in professional regulation. They reduce discretion. They reduce selective enforcement and makes it easier to tell a professional what not to do. But bright lines creates a trade-off. The clearer the boundary, the easier it becomes to design around it. If the rule says do not advertise, the actor asks what counts as an advertisement. If the rule says do not solicit, the actor asks what counts as solicitation. If the rule says do not endorse, the actor asks whether education about a product is an endorsement. The more formal the category becomes, the more valuable the boundary itself becomes as a target for arbitrage. But bright lines creates a trade-off. The clearer the boundary, the easier it becomes to design around it. That doesn't mean bright lines are useless. It means bright lines should sit around the underlying risk rather than the communication format. For example, a clear prohibition on guaranteed medical outcome is easier to administer than a vague prohibition on persuasive content. A clear requirement to disclose material financial interest is easier to administer than a rule against commercial looking content. A clear prohibition on patient testimonial is easier to apply than a general prohibition on building a personal brand. This is the direction in which the framework can resolve without turning NMC into a social media censorship agency. The regulator should not become the editor of doctors' Instagram feeds. It should become the designer of incentives around high-risk professional influence. That is a much narrower and much more defensible role. One more point deserves emphasis. The system should distinguish professional reputation from commercial solicitation. A doctor should be allowed to say who they are. A doctor should be allowed to state qualifications accurately. A doctor should be allowed to teach. A doctor should be allowed to participate in public health campaigns. A doctor should be allowed to discuss emerging evidence and explain uncertainty. If the regulation becomes so restrictive that doing any of these things is interpreted as self-promotion, the unintended consequence is to make the legitimate doctors less visible while leaving the attention market to less regulated voices. That is not a theoretical concern. The internet does not have a vacancy for no information. If credible professionals leave, something else fills the space. The correct regulatory objective is therefore not to minimize doctor visibility, it is to minimize harmful use of doctor credibility. That is a much better target, and it brings the episode back to the mechanism design. The goal is not to eliminate incentives, it is to align them. A doctor should have an incentive to produce accurate education. A doctor platform should have an incentive not to amplify dangerous medical claims merely because they perform well. A brand should have an incentive to disclose commercial relationship. A hospital should have an incentive to make the institutional marketing distinguishable from independent professional education. A patient should have enough information to understand whether a message is educational, promotional, or sponsored. And the regulator should have enough observable evidence to intervene when the line is crossed. That is a coherent system. The system is moving in that direction, but the categories have not yet fully converged. Segment 8, the blueprint. The blueprint is not let doctors advertise. It's not ban influencer doctors. It's not made every Instagram reel pass through NMC approval. The objective is to preserve the ethical reason for restricting professional solicitation while recognizing that the modern public communication has become a hybrid activity. Here are the 5 reforms ordered from most achievable to most aspirational. 1. Replace the binary advertising test with a 3-category disclosure framework. This targets failure mode 1. Category arbitrage. The first reform is relatively achievable because it does not require abandoning the existing prohibition. Create 3 categories for RMP digital communication: public education, professional promotion, and commercial endorsement. Public education would include factual health information prevention, general explanation of disease, and evidence summaries and public health communication. It would not be treated as advertisement merely because the doctor's professional identity is visible. Professional promotion would cover content that materially promotes the doctor's practice, expertise, services, outcomes, availability, and patient acquisition channels. It would not necessarily be prohibited, but it would carry stricter rules. No superlatives, no guarantees, no verifiable outcome claims, no exploitative patient stories, and clear professional identification. Commercial endorsement would cover paid or materially incentivized promotion of products, services, and brands. That category would require prominent disclosure, evidence standards, and additional restrictions for high-risk medical products. The critical design move is this: stop pretending that everything must be either education or advertising. There is a middle category, and that category is where most modern doctors' influence activity lives. Secondly, regulate the economic relationship, not the visible post. This targets failure mode 2. Attention market substitution. A doctor should not be required to prove that every educational video is commercially neutral. Instead, certain relationships should trigger disclosure obligations across the campaign, across the content. If a clinic employs the doctor and funds the channel, that relationship should be clearer. If a hospital funds the production, that should be disclosed. If a brand provides compensation, products, or affiliate income, or any other material benefit that should be disclosed. If the doctor contains a persistent commercial pathway to booking, purchasing, or subscribing, that should be treated as professional promotion rather than pure public education. The point is to follow the economic mechanism. The regulator does not need to prove that every video was an advertisement. It needs to know who benefits from the communication and how. Thirdly, create a single cross-regulator definition of health influence activity. This targets failure mode 3, regulatory fragmentation between NMC, the Department of Consumer Affairs, the ASCI, and other relevant bodies should publish a harmonized framework for medical and health influence communication. That framework should answer a basic set of questions consistently. What counts as material connection? What counts as professional promotion? What counts as health claim? What disclosures are required? What evidence is required for a claim? What responsibility falls on the doctor? What responsibility falls on the brand? What responsibility falls on a hospital or agency? And critically, what happens when a doctor is both a regulated professional and a paid influencer? Right now, the answer can depend too much on the rule book you are looking at. A harmonized framework would reduce arbitrage between regulatory silos. Fourth, move from disclosure-only compliance to claim and evidence standards for high-risk content. This targets failure mode 4, the disclosure paradox. Disclosure is necessary but not sufficient for high-risk medical claims, cancer treatment, fertility outcomes, weight loss promises, cosmetic procedures, supplements. Those are making disease-related claims, hormone therapies, and similar areas. The regulatory standard should focus on evidence as well as disclosure. A doctor saying sponsored does not make it a weak medical claim strong. The system should therefore distinguish low-risk educational content from a high-risk clinical claims. The higher the potential harm, the higher the evidentiary threshold. That is proportional regulatory model. It avoids a treating doctor explaining blood pressure in 30-second video the same way a doctor promoting a product with claims about treating a disease. Fifth, build a public-facing professional influence registry, not a censorship system, but an accountability layer. This is the most aspirational reform. The idea is not to pre-approve content. The idea is to make the commercial relationship around high-reach professional communication auditable. For doctors above a defined audience or a commercial threshold, disclose material relationship in a standardized public format. Hospital employment, clinical ownership, paid partnership affiliate arrangements, product advisory roles, and other relevant commercial interest. This would not mean that a doctor with a large following is presumed unethical. It is quite the opposite. It will allow large professional communicators to establish trust through transparency. It would give patients a way to distinguish three things that are currently blurred together: medical expertise, personal opinion, and commercial interest. These are not the same things. The 5 reforms shared one principle. None requires abolishing the professional advertising prohibition. None requires shutting down doctor education on social media. None require treating every influencer as a marketer. And none requires the regulator to decide whether a promotion is good or bad. They simply redesign the boundary around the economic mechanism. That shift is important. The old system asks, is this advertisement? The modern system should ask, what function is this communication performing? What relationship it supports? And what is the level of risk does it create? That is a much more durable question. The implementation detail matters because a badly designed reform can create the same problem under a new name. A 3-category framework, for example, should not become a paper exercise which every doctor simply labels everything as education. The categories have to be based on observable characteristics and incentives. A post that contains a direct booking pathway, a commercial offer, a product code, a paid partnership, a claim of a superior outcome, or a repeated promotion of a named service should not become educational merely because it also contains medical facts. like the professional promotion category should not become a disguised permission slip for aggressive marketing. Its purpose would be to acknowledge reality and make it transparent. A doctor should be able to tell the public where they practice and what they specialize in. The regulatory objective should not be to prevent deception, coercion, or exploitation, not to make the existence of medical practice invisible. The commercial endorsement category should be the strictest because it combines two forms of influence: professional credibility and commercial incentive. That combination deserves more scrutiny than ordinary consumer advertising, not less. The second reform also needs a practical threshold. A small educational account run by a doctor who receives no commercial benefit should not be treated like a professional media business generating sponsorship revenue. Proportionality matters. The obligation should rise with commercial scale and risk. The third reform should also include a common vocabulary. Today, one system may use influence, another advertiser, another endorser, another RMP, another as health expert. The same individual can fall into different categories at once. A common taxonomy would make compliance easier for doctors and agencies, would make endorsements less dependent upon which institution receives the complaint. The fourth reform should also be risk tiered. The highest risk claims deserve the strongest evidence requirements. A claim about a prescription medicine, disease treatment, cancer cure, a fertility outcome, a major procedure, or a medical device should be governed exactly like the general statement about sleep hygiene. But the regulatory burden should follow potential harm. And the fifth reform should be designed as transparency infrastructure rather than surveillance. The purpose of professional interest register would be to make the commercial relationship visible, not to create a database of everything that doctor says online. That distinction is essential if the reform to retain professional legitimacy. The larger lesson is that regulation works best when it makes the desired behavior easier than the arbitrage behavior. If the only safe strategy is to avoid social media entirely, good doctors will withdraw. If the only safe strategy is to label everything as education, commercial actors will exploit the label. If the system needs a middle path in which accurate, useful professional communication is easy to conduct and commercial influence is easy to identify. Closing down, come back to the sentence we started with. Soliciting patients directly or indirectly is unethical. That principle still makes sense. The reason it existed has not disappeared. Patients remain information asymmetric consumers. Professional authority remains unusually powerful. Medical claims can cause harm. Commercial incentives can distort judgments. And the title doctor still carries a credibility weight than the ordinary influence does not have. So the answer simply cannot be, let doctors advertise like everyone else. But the opposite answer, pretend that advertising is the only way of professional influence becomes commercial, is no longer convincing either. Because the modern doctor does not need to buy an advertisement. The doctor can build an audience. The audience can build trust. Trust can build preference, and preference can create patient acquisition. And all of it can happen without a single post looking like the kind of advertisement the 2002 rule were designed to recognize. That is that loophole. Not necessarily a loophole in the sense of a clever lawyer finding a sentence to exploit. The loophole in the deeper system sense. The market has found a route around the regulator's measurement category. And that is why a definitional loophole story, not a compliance story. The doctors are not the whole problem. The influencers are not the whole problem. The platform are not the whole problem. The NMC is not the whole problem. The system is producing a predictable gap because each institution is measuring a different part of the same transaction. The professional regulator measures solicitation. The consumer regulator measures misleading advertisement. The advertising ecosystem measures disclosure. The platform measures engagement. The market measures conversion. And the patient experience the combined result. So here is the question I would leave you with. If a doctor can influence millions of future patients without ever buying an advertisement, are we still regulating advertising, or are we regulating a market that no longer needs advertisement? That's it for this episode of Let's Break In. If this changed how you think about or react to medical content you now encounter differently, good. That's the whole point. Drop your take in comments and find me on LinkedIn. I read everything.